I think all of us would probably agree that most folks here and there through the years like a good story. They like a story that's full of interesting characters, that's got a good plot, that may have some morals to it, or lessons that we may learn from the words and the plot and the characters. And most of us like to have these things all tied up neatly at the end so we can get the point of why we've been reading or studying or hearing this story. What you and I refer to as Easter or Resurrection Sunday fits that description. It's been called the greatest story ever told. There is a classic book by a fellow who is deceased now, with this life story of Jesus, and he entitled it The Greatest Story Ever Told. Think of the characters in this Resurrection Sunday, this Easter story. There is Almighty and everlasting and eternal God in human flesh. Now, I don't know about you, but every once in a while, I'll let my human, finite, simple mind try to grasp the whole idea of God. That God has always been, and always is, and always will be. And I go back to that thing that's happened to me so many times through my vocational ministry career, and speaking with little folks like Hillary did this morning, down through the years, some of whom are now parents and even grandparents. And we'll say things like, you know, God made everything, and invariably, some little, I don't know what the right word is, y'all, I'm sorry, some little kid, you know, youngster, I've been told that little children are not baby goats, so I try not to say kids. Some child will say, who made God? How do you grasp that? That God has always been and just is everywhere and all powerful, and there's all kinds of fancy theological words, omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, and all those things. It simply means that God is all powerful and is everywhere and always has been. So in this greatest story ever told, there is this God who appears in the form, first of all, of what we call Christmas as a baby, who grows up to be a little guy, who grows up to be a teenager, and who grows up to be a 30-some-year-old man who has a 3-year ministry in an obscure, dirty, little dusty part of the world we call Palestine in that day and age. Today's modern state of Israel and the surrounding parts of the world. That God, that man, is one of these characters. Then there are his friends around him, the regular flesh and blood men and women, the fishermen, Peter and James and John, who have rough, calloused hands and who have a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. When the Bible says Peter swore to the young girl in the courtyard the night of Jesus' trial, I don't read Greek, but folks who do, whom I trust, have told me that Peter didn't say, oh my goodness gracious, my young friend, I do believe you are mistaken. The Bible said he, as my late father-in-law would said, cussed a blue streak. Here are these people with this kind of temperament. Matthew, a crook, a tax collector who robbed and cheated the people so he could pay not only his Roman overlord, but so he could make a profit himself. And so there are these people and all the other disciples, and one of the 12 closest friends of this God in human flesh is a trader. Not T-R-A-D-E-R who buys and sells goods, but a T-R-A-I-T-O-R who's going to sell his friend for $30. There are the characters in there. And then there are the religious and political leaders, the religious folks who didn't like this God in human form because he was messing up their tea party. People were following him instead of paying attention to them. And they did not like that. The political leaders didn't care for it either because they were afraid that the people were going to riot. There was noise and chaos and hubbub. And then there's the general public, some of whom couldn't have cared less. Others who were very excited, others who hated Jesus. On and on and on. So there are all these interesting characters. There is this plot that this God in human flesh has come so that people might know God, not that that God would know people, but that people might know God, might come to understand that the kingdom of God is not a military, it's not the Pentagon, it's not the army. It is turn the other cheek, love your neighbors, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. I find that really hard to do. Do you? I find it hard to do good to somebody who would persecute my way of life, or folks I see who I think are trying to destroy our nation and our society. It's really hard for me to love them. But Jesus' message says we're supposed to love them and to pray for them. So there is that plot. And you know how it all ends. And Jesus is turned in. He is crucified. As it happens, he's tried, a fake trial. He goes to his trial. He is sentenced to death, and he's hung on the cross, and he dies. A wonderful story. But when it comes to tying up this wonderful story, we think we know how it ends, and we do know how a lot of it ends. But the other day I was reading something, and here again I say is one reason we can know that the Bible is a living book. I don't mean living like you and I as people live, but alive and changing. And when I say changing, I don't mean the message of the Bible is changing. I mean that you and I can see a familiar passage or hear one or whatever, and all of a sudden something that has been there all along that we have never seen, the 100 times we've seen it before, will pop up. As I was reading some of these things, some of these passages, and working on sermon and studying and meditating, it became clear to me that here's one way this is tied up. One way it can make meaning for you and me. After the supper that Jesus and his disciples celebrated on Passover, you and I have come to know it as the Lord's Supper. The scriptures say that Jesus and his disciples went to a garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. It's still there. I looked it up. It's beautiful. It's got olive trees today and plantings and places folks can sit. It looks very peaceful and serene. We don't know what it really looked like in that day and age. To be sure, the olive trees and other vegetation and plants that are native to the area were there. But the point is that Jesus and his disciples went to a garden, and they had been used to going there. They had been there often. It was a place of rest and reflection. The scriptures say that Jesus took his 3 closest disciples and went to the garden and asked them to remain while he went off to pray. He began to pray, and he finished his prayer time. He came back and found them asleep. Well, there's an interesting a twist to the plot. Jesus asked them a simple favor, and they're unable to carry through. He asked them to stay and watch and keep awake, and they weren't able to. They had been in the garden before, as I said, all of them, and this particular time when they were in the garden for Jesus, it was a hard time. It was a time of agony. Look at Mark chapter 14, beginning with verse 32. The Bible says this, at that place, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. Jesus, the human Jesus, knew what lay ahead of him. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. He did not, humanly speaking, want to go through with this. And so he prayed to God, and he called him Daddy, Abba, in the Aramaic. You know, lots of words for our parents. There's mother and mama and mom and ma. There are words for our male parent, father, daddy, dad. They each carry a little bit different weight and a little different meaning. And I'm not knocking you or anyone you know who may refer to their male parent as father, but to me, there is a vast difference between father and daddy. I think you can be a father and not be a daddy, and that may just be Bob. Jesus is referring to God the Father as his daddy. And he says, "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, please. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Talk about complete and total surrender and trust, putting his life into God's hands. He has done that. But here's the deal. They are in a garden. And it's a hard time for Jesus. Well, this story goes on where Jesus is tried, arrested and tried, and it's a fake. And he's hung on the cross and he dies, and folks go home. His followers believe that things are over, even though they've been with him for 3 years. The disciples go and hide. The women go back to their places. But then after that's all over, on Easter Sunday morning, on the first day of the week, the scriptures tell us this. John chapter 20. Jesus appears. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Do you see, hopefully, what I'm trying to drive to? In the worst of Jesus' times, he was in a garden. The best of his times, when God has raised him to life, we see him in a garden. And his close friend, Mary Magdalene, thinks he is the gardener. Now, I'm not trying to major on a minor, say it's all about the garden. But I want us to understand how it ties together. Jesus later goes on and says to them, "Tell my followers, go, don't touch me right now. I haven't ascended to the Father to make sure that this is acceptable, but I'm coming back. Tell my disciples to go to Galilee." Do you remember that when Jesus began his earthly ministry, where he began it? In Galilee. And so he is going back to where he started. He is tying everything together. He has had the worst of his earthly life in a garden. He has had the best when the power of God. And we need to understand, Jesus didn't raise himself. Yeah, he walked out of the tomb, laid the claws and all, but the power of God the Father raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus is the conduit, if you will, the way, the truth, the life. And so here we see this tied together. Here's what I want us to understand, folks. You and I are in a garden. We call it the garden of life. And sometimes our garden is rough and rocky. Sometimes it's full of weeds. Sometimes the way is rough. As a little guy, when my mother, who loved a garden, sometimes I think better than she loved me, would invite me to help her in the garden, my task was to pick up rocks. I hated it. Collected enough rocks to build a rock wall, which we actually did at their house. Well, you see, the ground is rough. The way is hard. There are obstacles. Isaiah refers to the birth of Jesus. It says, "Prepare you the way of the Lord, make the rough places smooth." And so you and I are in this garden of rough places, of rocks and weeds. The ground is not smooth. How will we function? How will we get along? So it was with Mary at the cross. She had been with Jesus. She had seen his miracles. She loved him. She worshiped him. She washed his feet with a perfume, dried them with her hair. She was really there. But now she's in a garden, and it's tough. It's a hard time for her. The resurrection of Jesus changed her life. The resurrection changed everything. The resurrection did not change the rough parts of life. And one of the problems, one of the fallacies, one of the obstacles, roadblocks, whatever, of the Christian faith is folks think if I become a Christian, it's going to be a fairy tale. If I become a Christian, everything will always be wonderful. If I become a Christian and follower of Jesus, there will be no difficulties. I will not get sick. My loved ones will not get sick. I will have more money left over at the end of the month than the other way around. I will get that promotion. I will have a brand new truck. I will never have a flat tire. Everything will be wonderful. My children will be outstanding. It will all be good. That's the wrong answer, my friends. Because that is the human part of life, because we live in a hurt and broken and dying and sinful world. And so the resurrection of Jesus does not change these circumstances, the details of our human life in this world, but it changes us. It changed Mary. There were still rough and rocky places in her life. She was in a garden. There are rough and rocky places in your life, aren't there? There's some in mine. We are in a garden, the garden of life. The resurrection of Jesus will change us if we're let it. What do we do when we go to a physical garden? A few folks have begun to turn the soil. I was reading something the other day that encouraged people to not get too anxious. For one reason, tender plants would suffer. There's been some frost. We had a pretty good one the other day. And the weatherman, the long-range forecast, tells us that next week it's going to turn cold again. It also told us that don't turn up all the dead vegetation yet because some helpful insects are living in it, and so on and so forth. But when we do turn the soil and clear it and run off the rows, what do? We plant seeds, we cover them, we water them, we fertilize, whatever we need to do. As they begin to grow up, as Hillary said, the little tender shoots begin to come up out of the ground. What do? We take care of them. Why? Because we are hoping for a harvest to feed our bodies. My friends, we need to feed our souls even more. We need to understand what's really important. It is not the temporary, although that's nice. I suppose all of us look forward to some of the temporary things. I always like it when the silver queen corn comes in. But what's really important is the eternal. Those things which we can see, Paul writes, are temporary. It is those things which we cannot see that are eternal. So you and I, on this Resurrection Sunday, in this garden, need to consider that in Jesus' life, he was twice in the garden and once on the cross. And we need to ask ourselves, where are we? For Jesus, the worst of his time was in a garden. But then later, the very best of his time was in a garden. And so this story ties together. It ties neatly together. Now the story doesn't live in a neat world, but the story itself is God's will, and it's neat. And it's there for you and me to grab hold of, to accept. My friends, you and I may be in a garden now, but the resurrection invites us to live in the absolute best. We can live in this garden because Jesus lives. We can live day by day in this garden of life because he lives. I invite you to take a peek at your life, your garden. And as you hear this song of response, just listen to the words and ask yourself, am I living because he lives? And if you have some need, whatever it may be, I simply invite you to respond to that need because he lives.